Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive? Today, we're going to tackle something we all use every single day, our senses. Seeing, hearing, tasting, all that good stuff.
Yeah. It all seems pretty straightforward, right?
Right. But what if I told you those senses might be shaping your reality more than you even realize? Kind of trippy, huh?
It really is. We tend to think our senses give us this objective view of the world, but the truth is way more complicated.
We've got a super interesting scientific article to guide us today. It's called, get this, Rationality, Preferences, and Emotions with Biological Constraints. It all starts from our senses.
Catchy title.
Right. The authors, Rafael Polania, Denis Burdakov, and Todd A. Hare, really get into some thought-provoking stuff.
For sure. And they start off by reminding us that we're not these all-powerful beings. Our brains have limits, can't process everything perfectly.
Makes sense. It's like imagine trying to download the entire internet using dial-up. Not gonna happen.
Exactly. So our brains have to be efficient. They've evolved to prioritize, focus on the info that's most important for survival and, well, doing well in life. They call this efficient coding.
Okay, so our senses are like expert editors then,
hmm
taking this massive info overload and turning it into a story we can actually handle.
That's a great way to put it.
But how does that play out in our everyday lives? Like, how does this impact our choices and stuff?
Well, think about it this way. An engineer designing a voltmeter, they don't need it to be accurate across every single voltage imaginable, right?
Right.
Just the range that's relevant for what they're working on. Our brains are kind of similar. They give more processing power to the sensory information that matters most for our goals.
So it's not just about passively taking in information, it's about actively choosing what to focus on, what to prioritize based on what we need or want.
Exactly. And that connects to a concept from economics called rational inattention. Basically, we just can't pay attention to everything all the time. Our brains make choices about where to focus, what's valuable to us.
Now, here's where things get really interesting. The author suggests that this efficient coding, this way our brains prioritize, might actually be shaping our preferences, our likes and dislikes, without us even realizing it.
It's pretty wild. One study they talk about looked at how we perceive faces. Turns out, we tend to find faces that are statistically typical, those that resemble the average face, more attractive.
Wait, so we're drawn to average-looking people because our brains find them easier to process? That's a new take on the idea of beauty.
It is, isn't it? It seems like our brains really like predictability. And, well, things that are efficiently coded, they're inherently more predictable, easier to make sense of.
So beauty isn't just in the eye of the beholder, it's also in how that beholder's brain processes information.
Hmm.
But how far does this whole efficiency thing go? Does it affect other choices we make?
It might even influence how we feel about risk. Got to remember, our brains, they're not perfect calculators. The way we represent numbers, it gets kind of less precise as the numbers get bigger.
It's like our mental number line gets a little fuzzy at the edges.
Exactly. And because of that, our brains might underestimate the value of larger, riskier rewards.
So it's kind of like our brains saying, stick with what you know, the sure thing.
Yeah. This could be why many of us are naturally risk-averse. We'd like those smaller, guaranteed gains over the bigger, maybe not ones.
So our fear of risk could be tied to how our brains handle numbers. Efficient, but not always perfectly accurate.
Right. It's all about trade-offs. Our brains are always balancing accuracy, speed, and how much energy they use.
This is really making me think about how much we take our senses for granted. They're not just windows to the world, they're shaping the world we experience.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another layer, emotions. You might think they'd get in the way of efficient processing, but the authors suggest they're actually super important for survival.
Emotions.
Yeah.
Important for survival. How so?
Well, think about it. Emotions are often our first gut reaction to something, right?
Yeah.
And those reactions can be life-saving. Like see a snake, feel fear, jump back, all before you even consciously realize what you're seeing.
So emotions are like a super fast response system, bypassing all the thinking in those critical moments.
Exactly. And for that to work, our senses are really tuned to detect emotional cues super quickly.
Like before we even realize it.
Yep. They highlight a study, actually, where they found evidence of these emotion schemas encoded in early visual areas of the brain. So our brain might be labeling situations as good or bad before we even have time to think about it consciously.
Whoa. So our senses are like, what, emotional radar, always scanning for danger or good things, all happening under the surface.
Pretty much. And this early processing likely affects how we behave all the time. Our senses, guided by emotions, shape how we see the world, where our attention goes, even the decisions we make.
This is making me realize how much is going on beneath the surface of, just our everyday experience.
It really shows how interconnected everything is. Our brains, our bodies, the world around us. And it makes you wonder, if emotions play such a big role in how we perceive things, what other internal factors might be involved?
That's a great question. Maybe our senses are picking up on more than just the physical world. Like maybe they're representing things like goals and values.
It's pretty amazing to think, that our senses might be tuned in to more than just the physical stuff around us. Like imagine our senses actually helping us achieve our goals.
I don't quite get that. How can our senses, which usually deal with like sights and sounds and stuff, encode something as abstract as a goal?
Well, the authors talk about this study where researchers used fMRI scans to see what was happening in people's brains while they were imagining using different objects, for survival. They wanted to see how the brain represents how useful objects would be in like a life or death scenario.
So they're not just looking at what an object I lost, but what it could do in a specific situation.
Yeah, exactly. And what they found, it actually kind of challenges some of the traditional ideas about how our brains work. It turned out that information about an object's usefulness wasn't just showing up in the prefrontal cortex.
The prefrontal cortex, that's the part of the brain that handles like planning and making decisions, right?
Right. But it was showing up in the sensory areas too.
You mean like the parts of the brain that process basic visual information?
Exactly. Even at those early stages of processing, our brains might be encoding information about how relevant objects are to our goals. It's like this efficiency thing, this prioritization we talked about. It might be woven into like the very fabric of how we experience the world through our senses.
So it's almost like our senses are asking, is this thing useful? Is this important for what I'm trying to do? Not just passively taking in info, but actively evaluating it.
It really raises some interesting questions about how we perceive things. Like if our senses are so tied to our goals and motivations, does that mean our view of reality is totally objective? Or is it, like we've been saying, more of a model that prioritizes what's important for us to succeed?
I'm starting to think that seeing is believing might be a bit too simple.
Yeah, maybe. And remember that study about how we find average faces more attractive? Well, this idea that efficient processing can shape our preferences, it might go way beyond just how we see faces. Think about how we tend to avoid risks.
Hold on, how does that connect to efficient coding?
Well, we talk about how our brains process numbers, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how that gets less precise as the numbers get bigger. So let's say you have two options. One, a small reward that's guaranteed, and two, a much bigger reward. But there's some risk involved.
Logically, the bigger reward sounds better, even with the risk.
Right. But our brains, because of that fuzziness with big numbers, they might actually underestimate how good that bigger reward really is.
So it's like our brain is saying, go for the sure thing, the one that's easy to understand.
Exactly. And that could be why so many of us are naturally risk-averse. We prefer the smaller guaranteed gain over the maybe huge, maybe not gain.
So something like being afraid to take risks, which we usually think of as a personality thing, could actually be tied to how our brains handle information.
It all points back to this idea of efficient coding. And it shows how deeply our biology is connected to our thoughts, our feelings, even what we do. So like nature and nurture are always working together. Our genes give us a basic blueprint, but our experiences and goals shape how that blueprint plays out.
That makes me think about learning and adapting. If our senses are constantly changing what they prioritize based on our goals and experiences, can they change over time? Like, can we train our senses to be better in certain areas?
That's a great question, and researchers are definitely looking into it. But there's more and more evidence suggesting that our senses are much more adaptable than we used to think. They're always adjusting based on our environment and how we're feeling.
So it's not just about the hardware we're born with, but also the software that's constantly being updated.
Exactly. Think about how, like, musicians develop this incredibly sensitive hearing. They can pick up on these tiny changes in pitch and tone, or how sommeliers can taste all these different flavors and aromas in just one sip of wine.
So our senses aren't stuck in one place. They're constantly evolving based on what we need them to do. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, this adaptability is crucial for us to thrive in different environments that are always changing. Imagine our ancestors trying to survive out in the wild. They would have to be super aware of everything around them, right? Like a rustling leaf or a snapping twig could mean danger, or maybe it means food.
So evolution would favor the folks with really adaptable senses, the ones who could learn to focus on the most important information in any given situation.
Right. And that brings us back to emotions and how they affect our perception. We talked about how emotions are like a rapid response system, guiding our attention and actions when something important is happening. But what about like the more subtle everyday emotions? How do those affect how we experience things?
It makes me wonder, like, if you're in a good mood, do your senses become more open to positive stuff, like a beautiful sunset or a really delicious meal?
That's a really interesting idea.
Yeah.
And what about the opposite? If we're feeling stressed or anxious, are we more likely to notice things that could be threatening, even if they're not actually dangerous?
It's almost like our emotions are a filter. They color how we see the world around us.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And this idea that how we're feeling inside can change how we perceive things, it opens up a whole bunch of new questions about what's real and what's not.
So not only are our senses always filtering and prioritizing information based on our goals and experiences, but they're also being influenced by our emotions, by our mood, by how we're feeling overall.
It's pretty complex, isn't it? But also fascinating.
It is, and it makes you realize that the world we experience, it's not necessarily objective reality, it's more like a subjective creation, shaped by all these different factors.
This leads us to the final and maybe most challenging question that this research brings up. If our senses are so connected to our internal world, to our goals, our motivations, even our unconscious biases, how much of what we perceive is really real?
That's a really deep question. And it might just change how we see ourselves and the world.
It really is wild to think about, that something like our mood, something that can change so quickly, could actually be messing with our senses.
Yeah, it definitely makes you question things. Like, we tend to think of our senses as being separate from all the stuff happening inside us, but this research is saying that's not really true.
Right. There's more and more evidence that our emotions, what we're trying to do, even those biases we're not aware of, can change how sensitive our senses are, how much we notice, how we make sense of it all.
It's like our senses have this volume knob that's being adjusted based on what's happening inside us.
I like that. A volume knob for our senses. Makes you think, doesn't it?
It does. So what kind of examples are we talking about here? Like, how does this actually play out?
Well, imagine, let's say you're walking home alone late at night
Yeah.
and you're feeling a little anxious,
Yeah.
right? What happens?
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Your senses probably go on high alert. Every little sound, every shadow seems way more intense, maybe even dangerous. Your brain is basically prioritizing anything that could be a threat, even if, realistically, there's nothing there.
So our own fear can actually make us more sensitive to things that fit with that fear, even if they're not really dangerous.
Exactly. And the opposite can happen too. Think about like relaxing on a beach, feeling totally safe and content. You might not even register the seagulls squawking or the kids playing nearby.
Because your brain is filtering all that out like it's not important right now.
Yeah, your brain in that chill state is basically saying, yeah, not important.
So it's not just that our senses are taking in information. They're actively shaping it, filtering it, deciding what to emphasize, what to downplay, all based on what's going on inside us and what's happening around us.
It's this constant back and forth, like our brains are trying to give us the best, most useful experience, and in a way that keeps us safe. Thinking back to our ancestors again, imagine trying to survive in the wild, being able to adjust your senses based on what you need, like be super alert when there's danger and then conserve energy when it's safe. That would be a huge advantage.
Totally. So if our emotions can have such a big impact on our senses, can we use that to our advantage? Could we actually train ourselves to, I don't know, control our sensory input, become more aware of how what's going on inside us is affecting how we see things?
Now, that's a fantastic question and something that's getting a lot of attention these days, especially in fields like mindfulness and meditation. The idea is if we can become more aware of what's happening inside us, our thoughts, our feelings, what's going on in our bodies, then we can better understand how it's affecting our perception and maybe even learn to change it.
So instead of being controlled by our emotions and biases, we can actually become more aware of them and make better choices about how we react to things.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that how we see the world isn't fixed. It's fluid, always changing. And to some extent, we can learn to influence that.
This whole deep dive has been amazing. We started by looking at how our brains prioritize information, this efficient coding thing. Then we got into how our goals and motivations actually shape how we see the world, how our senses are kind of designed to help us achieve what we're trying to do. And now we've come full circle, realizing that even our emotions, our moods, how we're feeling inside, it's all playing a part in shaping our reality.
It's a lot to take in, but it's pretty incredible when you think about it.
I know. It reminds us that we're not just passively watching the world go by, we're active participants,
hmm
shaping our own reality through how our senses, our brains, and our inner world all work together.
It's a beautiful thing. So as you go about your day, pay attention. See if you can notice how your mood, your stress levels, even your expectations might be changing how you see things.
And remember, the world you experience, it's not necessarily the objective truth. It's a unique creation shaped by you, your experiences, your goals, and the incredible, always adapting power of your senses.